Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are tuning in around the world. We are so glad that you are with us again tonight for this edition of Stories and Myths. I am your host, Craig von Buseck, and I have a special guest with me tonight, Dr. Rebecca Price Janney, who is an expert and a historian and a theologian and a multi-published award-winning author. And we are so glad, Rebecca, that you're with us tonight. Good evening.
Good evening, Craig. It's a joy to be here.
Well, thank you so much. And, you know, you and I have met through writers' conferences and through Facebook and through other things like that. And so I've always been fascinated with your historical knowledge. And then we connected more recently through my book, Victor, the final battle of Ulysses S. Grant.
Yes.
And I absolutely loved last week. You were at a reenactment and
Yes.
you ran into Ulysses S. Grant.
I did.
At the reenactment. Now tell me about that story. Where were you and what was going on?
Every Sunday on the closest day to July 8th, my hometown, Easton, Pennsylvania, has what's called Heritage Day, because our community was one of the first three to read the Declaration of Independence publicly. So every year we have a Patriots parade, beginning with soldiers from the Revolutionary War, and we march around the circle, and we have an actor who reads the Declaration.
Oh, wow.
And as he was finishing and the shots were fired, I smelled cigar smoke. And I followed the trail and I said to my husband, "There's General Grant." This man looks like General Grant.
Oh, he really did.
He really did. And then we met in the green room afterwards. Right. And I was telling him all about you and your book. And he looked at me and he said, "I've already read it."
Really? I did not know that. Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
And he loved it.
Oh, well, that is fantastic. I'd like we'll talk more about that offline, but that's exciting. Very cool. Now, tell me a little bit about how you first got interested in history, because you've taken a deep dive. I mean, you've done intensive study academically, but also intensive research. So tell us a little bit about how you got interested in and how you got involved in following after history.
I think it started when I was very young. My parents were real interested in history. And my father was a World War II veteran, and he helped liberate one of the concentration camps. And through that experience, he became a strong supporter of the state of Israel.
Wow.
And both my parents raised me to love and respect Israel. And of course, I learned all about Israel and the Jewish people, not just through them, but through Sunday school and the Bible. And so it was a natural sort of thing. And even though I was reading all the kid lit of the time, my parents always made sure that I had biographies of famous Americans.
Yes.
And I think that's how it started. It was very natural for me.
Wow. So you went on to do both some academic work on both sides, right? The theological side, but also the historical side. And then you started doing reenactments and work with the Daughters of the Revolution. And you've written, what, 24 books? Is that correct?
24 published. I'm working on 25 now.
Right. I always have to differentiate for people. They'll say, "How many books do you have?" And I say, "Well, 10 published, but I've written 15.
Yeah.
You know, 'cause some of them are ghostwritten and I can't get them published because I don't own them, you know. So,
of course.
I know exactly what you're talking about. So that is an impressive resume. Tell me a little bit about how you got involved with the Daughters of the Revolution, because I find that to be a fascinating organization.
I grew up knowing about them, and something in me really drew me to them, but I had no idea that I could ever be part of the group, because you have to have a proven Revolutionary War patriot
Right.
to join. And it can't be a distant cousin or uncle. It has to be a direct ancestor.
Right.
And I knew that my father's family came from Italy, so there was no DAR there. And when I would ask my grandmother when I was growing up, my maternal grandmother, where we were from, she would say, "Oh, we were from Easton." And I'd say, "I know that, but where was the family originally from?"
Right.
Well, my grandmother didn't even know her own grandmother's name, let alone where they were from. But I knew from the stories that we were Pennsylvania Dutch and Welsh. I just didn't know how far back. And then in 2010, 11, I was trying to come up with an idea for a birthday present for my mom, who had everything she needed. And I thought, well, I'm a historian. I do research. Why don't I do a family tree?
Oh, wow. Good idea.
So I did that 2-week trial with Ancestry.com, 2 weeks for free. And I couldn't believe how far back I was pushing, that I actually got back to the 18th century by the time my trial ran out. And I thought, that's enough for now. I'm not coughing up $100 to join this group. But then I couldn't not go further back.
Yeah. You had the hook in the
I
jaw.
was hooked.
Yeah.
So I searched and found not just one patriot, but several.
Wow.
And
on your mother's side.
On my mother's side.
Isn't that interesting?
Just blew me away. And one of them was a colonel at the Battle of Brooklyn, which was the first battle after the Declaration.
Oh, yeah. Very interesting battle. And by the hair of their teeth, they escaped battle.
And he and his regiment helped make it possible for them to escape.
Wow, that's so cool.
And I remember in my book, Great Stories in American History, back in the 90s, writing about the miraculous escape. And there was something about that story that just took hold of me.
Yeah, me too.
I didn't know, but I found out that I had 4 or 5 ancestors in that battle.
Oh, well, my goodness.
I had skin in the game.
Yeah, for sure.
So I contacted the DAR, and at that time I was living in suburban Philadelphia, and the Valley Forge chapter reached out to me, and they helped me fill out my application and join.
Wow.
So
that's like blue blood, Valley Forge. That's blue blood.
But you know, Craig, it's the American dream, the American story, that on one side, recent immigrants, and on the other side, these people who ended up coming around the 1640s in New England.
Very early. That's very
early.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. On my dad's side, the earliest was 1815 or thereabouts. They arrived in Erie, Pennsylvania. And just 3 years ago, Erie Insurance, which is one of the largest employers there, took our family residence. It would have been my great whatever grandfather's brother's house, and they took it apart piece by piece from out in the woods, and they brought it to downtown Erie, right across the street from Erie Insurance, and rebuilt it.
Wow.
And they put up a historical marker, and it's called the Von Buseck House.
That's exciting.
It's exciting, but it's not far enough back. It's not as way far back like yours. But on my mother's, or on my grandmother's side, on my father's side of the ledger, she was the last one born in her family, and she was born in America, but all of her older sisters were born in Ireland.
Is that right?
So she came over they came over in 1900 or 1899, and she was born in 1900, right in that range. So much later on that side. Then on my mom's side, they're Beckers. On her, her maternal name was Becker. And then on her mother's side, she was from Ukraine. And but we have no data on that side. We don't know what the dates are. So I could have a revolutionary fighter from the Beckers. I don't think from the Ukrainians, but the Beckers might have. They might have been Hessians, for all I know. Fighting on the British side. Yeah, you never know. But I don't have any records on that side.
Mm.
So tell me, how did you then? So they brought you in Valley Forge, and then you started. Is that when you started doing reenactments?
The only reenactments that I really do are here in Easton.
Okay.
I portray the wife of my ancestor. Like many people back in that era, there were multiple marriages in families because people died younger. Right. And many women died in childbirth. Yes. And I believe that's what happened to my ancestor, Colonel Peter Kishline. Wow. So his first wife is my ancestor, and his third wife was who he was married to at the time of the Battle of Brooklyn. And I portray her, and my husband portrays him.
Yes, I've seen the photos. It's fantastic of the two.
It's a lot of fun.
It really is cool.
And I enjoy that. And one of the fun things about this past Sunday when we had it was how many people came up to us and wanted to have their pictures taken with us. There were many families there with small children. Yeah. And it just really did my heart good.
That is great. Well, it's really interesting that you say those things because I have those things on both sides of my family. My great-grandmother died giving birth to my grandfather.
Is that right?
Yeah, so he was the youngest in that family. And then on the other side, my great aunt died, or aunt, depending on where you are in the country. Mm-hmm. We were all raised with aunts where I was from. But my great aunt died, and then her husband married her youngest sister.
Oh, so my goodness.
It's like all in the family.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. So behind you, I see several of your books.
Yes.
Congratulations on all of those books. And some have been award-winning books as well. Can you tell us about some of the award-winning books?
In 2019, I received the Historical Novel of the Year award for, let me see, I'm thinking I got first place. That was for Easton at the Crossroads. And in my Easton novels, I tell the story of Colonel Kishline from 1776 and then through the Revolution. So that book was about the Battle of Brooklyn.
Wow.
And
okay.
There are two characters in the book, him and his fictional descendant who lives now. And the second book got second place, and it's the first book in my series about American revivals. And that one is called Morning Glory. It's about the First Great Awakening.
Yes.
So these were Golden Scroll Awards, and I went to Nashville to receive the awards, and I didn't know in advance that I was getting them. And so when they called my name, I went up on stage, and when I was getting the award, the announcer said, "Oh, and she also got second place for Morning Glory." So I got these two plaques.
Nice.
And one of my favorite singers, Michael W. Smith, was sitting just a few feet away.
Yep. And I was in the room. I was there.
You were there?
I was, yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I saw all of this. So this is tell the audience what else happened, because it was a great day.
It was just an amazing day. When you get something like that and you're not expecting it, it's just one of those life moments that you never forget.
Yeah. Well, that is very exciting. So I want to hear, first of all, about the Easton Books. Obviously, that's your hometown.
Yes.
And, when I was being trained as a writer, my mentor told us, write what you know. And it sounds to me like you took the same path.
I took a very circuitous path to that because I had been writing historical nonfiction. So I wrote several books about American history and culture. And about 2013, 14, my husband and I had been living in the Philadelphia area for most of our married life. So I graduated from college and moved away from my hometown, ended up living in suburban Philadelphia after grad school. And for 1 year, we lived elsewhere. And that was a very hard year for me. And I was extremely homesick. And I found myself being homesick for my hometown.
Mm-hmm.
And it was at that time that I had made all these discoveries about my ancestry and realized that the homesickness was in part due to my very deep roots in that area and how my family was still here.
Yeah.
And so one way that I coped with the homesickness was to write this story about my ancestor. Mm-hmm. And my agent thought it was a really good idea for a series of novels. And Elk Lake Publishing caught the vision.
Nice.
And that's how it happened.
That's amazing. If you look over, wrong one, over this shoulder here, that book right there is called Nobody Knows, the Harry T. Burleigh story. And it's the story of an African-American composer who, more than anyone else, he made the Negro spirituals known to the world. Well, it just so happens that he was born and raised in Erie, Pennsylvania.
Oh.
And so that's how I heard his story. But then as I started to dig into it, I realized that he was handpicked by J.P. Morgan, the J.P. Morgan, to be the baritone soloist at their church in Manhattan. Then through Morgan, he was able to sing for Teddy Roosevelt when he was governor in Albany, and King Edward at Buckingham Palace. He was personal friends of Booker T. Washington and used to open for him. But then when he died, he also influenced Antonin Dvorak in the writing of the New World Symphony.
Oh, one of my favorites.
Yeah. Well, the second movement, which later one of Dvorak's students put words to, and it was called Going Home.
I love that.
Yeah. Dvorak said that he based that song on Harry T. Burleigh's voice.
Oh my!
And so Burleigh strongly, and in Musical American magazine, Dvorak said that one of my students, Harry Burleigh, strongly influenced the writing of this symphony. And so when Burleigh died, the Los Angeles Times called him the dean of the Negro spirituals because more than anyone else, he made them known to the world. But like you, I was homesick. I was living in Virginia. I missed my home. And I saw someone do a one-act play about Burleigh, and I said, that's it. That's what I'm writing. And there it is.
Isn't that wonderful how inspiration strikes?
Right. In so many ways.
When I went to Asbury College, now university, with my husband for his college reunion back in 1995, it was the 25th anniversary of a huge revival that broke out in 1970, a revival that spread around the country, and the effects are still being felt today.
Yes.
And do you know, Craig, that story would not let me go.
Yeah.
And I wrote about it in several of my books, little excerpts about it. And yet I still felt like I wasn't finished. And I thought, I need to write a novel about this.
Oh, interesting.
And that became Sweet, Sweet Spirit, one woman's journey from the 1968 assassinations to the Asbury College revival.
Yeah.
And I got to be there last year for the 50th anniversary, and it was right before COVID hit.
Yeah.
So I remember being in my hotel room in Kentucky, watching the news and seeing what was happening in China and thinking, oh, I'm glad it's not here. But what really stood out to me about that, about being there, was I kept looking for people of a certain age, because when I found them, they were there during 1970, and I could not get enough of their stories.
Yeah. Yeah. My father rededicated his life to the Lord during that revival.
No, really?
Yeah. And of course, that then led to our entire family. All of the children dedicated their lives to the Lord over time. So
was he at Asbury at the time?
No, Erie, Pennsylvania. And it was actually through a spirit-filled Roman Catholic priest and a spirit-filled Church of God in Christ pastor that, got involved in his life, and God did the rest. So
that is amazing.
Yeah, well, that, like you said, that the Jesus movement,
Yes.
that revival was very important. Now, you said in your information that you sent to me that you believe that we are prime for another move like that. Tell me what brings you to think that, because a lot of people feel like there's not a lot of hope in the future.
Mm-hmm. As a historian, as a researcher of American revivals, I've seen a pattern that they tend to break out at the worst of times. And especially when I look back on what was happening in that period between 68 and 70, the country was coming apart. And when I tell him, I have a teenage son, when I talk to him about Martin Luther King dying in April of 68, and then 2 months later, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, that a lot of people at that time were overwhelmed with despair.
Yeah.
And that's
not again. You hear that so many, because John F. Kennedy and Malcolm X and others,
Medgar Evers.
Yeah, they had been killed prior to that, and then boom, King in April and Bobby in June.
Yes.
Man.
And then you had the Vietnam War tearing the country apart, lots of unrest on college campuses. And I think you had this little quiet Wilmore, Kentucky town. And I've been there several times now. And every time I go there, I compare it to Mayberry on the old Andy Griffith show. And if some of your listeners have not seen the Andy Griffith show, you can watch it on reruns. And it's this piece of Americana that still exists in this little town. And God chose this little place, this college that I had never even heard of until I met my husband at Princeton. And he chose this place to ignite a revival among young people who were searching, who were feeling like they were lost. And I just find that so encouraging for us today, because I think that the Holy Spirit does tend to break through when times are the darkest and when God's light shines the brightest.
Yeah.
So I am in great anticipation of what he's doing. And I've seen rumblings of revival breaking out here and there. And I'm very hopeful.
Amen. Amen. Well, and it's very biblical concept. When the enemy comes in like a flood, the Lord will raise up a standard against him. And some people say the key is where you place the comma. Is it when the enemy comes in like a flood, comma, or is it when the enemy comes in, comma, like a flood, comma, God will raise up a standard? I like the second version better. Now, the ancient language didn't have the punctuation, but I think both parts can be true depending on how you stress that. But I wanted to read to you, here's a comment that came in from Jackie Fessenden. I love the Easton Books since I also have ancestors from that area and probably knew Rebecca's ancestors. So hello to Jackie. And how about if you comment on that? Do you know if there's any connection?
I think there probably is, because Easton was not a very big place around the time of the Revolution. And Jackie and I are good friends. Her husband is actually my agent.
Oh, okay, Dave.
And Dave Fessenden, yes.
Yeah.
And so I do believe that somehow Jackie and I have these very old connections, and it's very special to me.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. How many times you look back in history, and back then, because the population was so much smaller, there was a much higher incidence of people running into each other.
Yes.
And so I tell the story to give an example of that. And it blows people away when they hear this, that Robert Lincoln was coming back from Harvard to visit his mom and dad at the White House. And at some train station along the way, he was on the platform and somebody tripped or something. And Robert was pushed off the platform as a train was coming into the station. And he would have likely been killed. But this guy risked his own life. The guy on the platform risked his life, reached down, pulled Robert up onto the platform and saved his life. Well, that man was John Wilkes Booth's brother.
No. Oh,
irony, isn't it? And I think it was
very,
about a year.
very ironic.
I think it was Edwin Booth, the actor.
Wow.
And I'm not sure. I have to confirm that. But here, John Wilkes Booth's brother saved Robert Lincoln's life. And a year later, his other brother assassinated the father. So and then you go even further back in Lincoln's life, and his grandfather, who was Abraham Lincoln the First, was good buddies with Daniel Boone. And it was Daniel Boone that convinced Abraham Lincoln Sr. to move to Kentucky.
Is that right? Which
is where Abraham Jr., two generations down, was born. So pretty amazing.
It is.
Oh, here's another one. Abraham Lincoln's father, wait till you hear this. Abraham Lincoln's father, his grandfather, Abraham, was killed by an Indian. And the Indian tried to come and steal Thomas Lincoln, which was the president's father, who was 5 at the time. But his older brother shot and killed the Indian and saved his life. But now they didn't have a father. So Thomas went from different place to different place being trained as an apprentice. And one of the places where he trained as a carpenter's apprentice was in the Brown household. So he got to know this guy named John, who was the son of the guy who was his, doing the apprenticeship. So Abraham Lincoln's father lived for a time with John Brown. I mean,
amazing.
It's like,
that is so amazing.
It is really amazing. And so that's why it's not surprising that you and Jackie would probably have some connections back in the day.
I have a similar story to tell, that when I was a teenager, I was fascinated with the life of Robert Kennedy. And that's how this connection happened, that I wrote about a young woman who was fascinated with him and then ended up at the Asbury College revival. But when I was researching, I found out that there was a young man at, I think it was Biola. No, it was Azusa Pacific, because Asbury sent witness teams of college students into various parts of the nation, and they would speak at colleges, and revival would break out there too.
Wow.
And a group of Asburyans went to Azusa Pacific, and a young man felt compelled, a student there, to go and witness to the family of Sirhan Sirhan. And I was so fascinated by that. And I worked it into the novel.
Wow.
And when I was at Asbury to launch my book a year ago, my husband went with me, and he was at the back of Hughes Auditorium with my books, and I was down front meeting people. And I looked and I saw my husband walking towards me with this man. And he said, "Oh, Rebecca, you have to meet this guy." And I we shook hands. We were still shaking hands then. And he introduced himself, and my husband said, "Tell her who you are." He was the student from Azusa Pacific who went and witnessed to Sirhan's family.
Oh my gosh.
I was blown away.
Oh man. It just blows you away when those kind of things happen.
And then he told me how it all happened. And it was a very long story, but the gist of it was that he had worked with Sirhan's brother. They had a job in the same place. And when all this happened, he just really felt for the family and wanted to reach out to them.
Wow. Wow. That is phenomenal.
It was.
So do you know the rest of the story? Did the family respond, or do you know anything that happened after that encounter?
He said that they were Arab Christians.
Right, Palestinian.
Yes. So they were responsive. They were not like, "Oh, I'm going to be saved now." It wasn't like that, but they were very friendly to him and very kind. And he didn't ever know what happened either. Yeah. I think he tried to keep in touch with the brother, but then they never did.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll eventually either here or in heaven hear the rest of that story, because that's an amazing story. It really is. Wow, that's incredible. Now, you picked up my book at some point. How did you hear about Victor? Because you used it in your own program. What was it? It was Memorial Day, right?
Yes, that's right. I love Ulysses Grant. He's been a hero of mine for a long time.
Yeah.
And I think I just saw on your social media that you had published a book about him, and I think you reached out to tell me about it. And, a lot of times that somebody will say, "Oh, I just published a new book," and
sure.
And I'm happy for them, but I might not be all that interested.
Yeah, there are books galore.
Yes.
Right.
But yours just really stood out, especially when I found out that it was about his final battle. And so I read it, and I mean, it was a page turner.
Oh, thank you. That's good to hear.
I think that the encouragement and the uplift that it gave me, and I think I told you that I'm the product of a mixed marriage here, that my husband, that his family fought in the Stonewall Brigade.
Right.
And my family was in the Pennsylvania 153rd. So,
wow.
Yeah, we were on opposite sides of the Civil War.
I think I was just reading about them last night. I'm reading the second day at Gettysburg right now.
Yes, they did end up at Gettysburg.
Yeah.
They were there.
Yeah, I think I just read about him last night.
That's neat. But I think, we've had this little rivalry going because his ancestor actually died at the Battle of Chancellorsville and was in the Stonewall Brigade. So for an early anniversary present, I gave him one of these beautiful historic prints of Stonewall at Chancellorsville, and it's in our dining room.
Wow.
And I always would joke with him about, well, one of these days Grant's going to go on the other side. But through that book, my husband has come to appreciate Grant in a new way as well.
Oh, wow. That's pretty wonderful.
Yeah. And he's a Presbyterian minister. And one of your stories made its way into a sermon a few weeks ago.
Ooh, which one? Could I ask? Do you remember?
I think it was the Memorial Day one.
Okay. Yeah.
Or it might have been the funeral. I think I podcasted about Memorial Day.
You spoke about the troops walking past his house on East 66th Street in Manhattan.
Yes.
So then your husband spoke about Grant's funeral.
Yes. Yeah. And about how Julia Grant insisted that there be representatives from the South as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so the pallbearers included Buckner, General Buckner, who was a West Point friend of Ulysses, Simon Boulevard Buckner. And then when Ulysses was at one of his darkest moments after he got pushed out of the Army because of his alcoholism. He didn't have any money, and so he couldn't even get home from California. And so some of the other quartermasters gave him enough money to get a fare back to New York, but that was as far as he could get. And he ran into Simon Bolivar Buckner, who loaned him the rest of the money to get all the way home. So later, when Grant was dying, Buckner said to the reporters, when Grant was down on his luck, he loaned me or I loaned him some money. But then when I was down on my luck, I loaned him my whole army, because Buckner was the one who surrendered at Fort Donelson after Grant said no terms but unconditional surrender, which is the press picked up the U.S. Grant. And from then on, they called him Unconditional Surrender Grant. And so it was him. And then it was General Joseph Johnston on the Confederate side, and then on the Union side, it was William Tecumseh Sherman, and then there were actually several generals that were on horseback from both the North and the South, including Fitzhugh Lee, who was there for the funeral in New York City. That funeral, as you saw in the book, is still the largest live funeral, open air in American history. They had more than 1.5 million people that flooded into Manhattan that day. So much so that they were running some of the trains with 2 or 3 steam engines, because there were so many cars to move all those people. And I've seen the photos. I went to the Grant Presidential Library at Mississippi State University, and they have photos of the funeral. And there were people who were climbing in trees, people sitting on the edge of rooftops. There were people who climbed on top of telephone poles just to be able to get a view to say goodbye to General Grant. Next to President Lincoln, Grant was the most popular American in the 19th century, and people forget that, mostly because of the lost cause propaganda that came against him. But really it was after the Civil Rights Movement. And I do believe that the Civil Rights Movement had a big part in helping to restore Grant's reputation, because after that, academics and writers and historians started taking another look and digging deeper. And then, of course, with the internet, that makes it a little easier as well. And so Grant has had a renaissance in the last 30 years. And my feeling was, a lot of people had told his overall story, but I had never seen, I shouldn't say that. There were a couple books that did tell this story, but they never connected it back to the battles.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to do, was as he was writing his memoirs, as he's dying of cancer, he's writing the memoirs to save his family from ruin. And so I wanted to take people back to show the battles, to show why he was writing these, why it was so important. Not only at that time, but for us today as well.
Yes.
So thank you for adding me on your podcast. That was a wonderful surprise.
My pleasure. Have you ever seen the picture of young Teddy Roosevelt looking out the window at the funeral?
Well, I've seen the one of him looking at Lincoln's funeral. I don't know that I've seen the one looking at Grant's funeral.
Maybe I have them mixed up.
Yeah, you may be thinking of that. However, there were some really interesting people looking at Grant's funeral, including Mark Twain, who was in his offices. He had, Mark Twain had a publishing company called Charles Webster and Company, which was his niece's husband. And Twain used the name as a cover so people wouldn't know that it was his company.
Yes. And
so he and Charles Webster were in their offices over Union Square watching the funeral. But only a couple blocks down, the man who had deceived Ulysses and Buck Grant, a man named Ferdinand Ward, he was up in a window because he had bribed a guard at the jail to take him to watch the funeral. So there was the man who caused this major downfall of Grant's finances, which some people, say led to Grant's, descent of his health. Well, he
Mhm.
had also smoked cigars for, pipes and cigars for 40 years. That
Right.
probably had something to do with it as well. But you never know that the stress of what he went through in losing his business and being so embarrassed, that
Mhm.
could have, triggered the cancer. Who knows? We don't
Very
know.
much. Very much
Yeah.
so.
So yeah, some really interesting people who were there for that final ride from City Hall out to Riverside Park, where at the time they had a temporary tomb that was just a rounded kind of, it almost looked like the World War II Army barracks, but it was made out of brick. And they put Grant's coffin in there. And then it took them, I think it was 7 or 8 years to raise the money.
Mhm.
And at one point, the fundraising totally dried up. And
Mhm.
so the Grant family went to Colonel, who became a general, Horace Porter, who was on Grant's staff. And he was a very trusted friend of Grant. And they said, the fundraising has stopped. Will you take over and kickstart it? And he did. And I mean, it just started pouring in because he was such a great leader. And so when they dedicated Grant's tomb and they transferred the coffin into what we now know as Grant's tomb,
Mhm.
President McKinley spoke, and also General Horace Porter. And
Mm.
Julia Grant was there with Fred on the steps. That was, not long before she died. And of course, she's now entombed next to Grant in
Mhm.
the beautiful red granite sarcophagi there in Grant's
Mhm.
tomb. So pretty amazing stuff.
It is.
Yeah,
It
very
truly
cool.
is.
So what is next for you? What do you have your sights set on after this?
I'm working on the 5th Easton book right now, and it's my first Christmas book. So I'm living at Christmas time all the time right now.
Christmas in July.
Christmas in July. I just sent out a newsletter today and was talking about how confused I get at times when I'm writing checks or writing in my journal. I forget what month it is.
Right.
But it's been a lot of fun. And what I try to show is the similarities between Colonel Kishline's life and his descendants, because I believe that while circumstances change, people and human nature generally stay the same. So she learns a lot from what he's been through. And in each book, they're going through something very on a parallel kind of track.
Yeah.
So in book 1, she loses her husband, he loses his wife, and she is encouraged and takes courage from his example. So it's that kind of storyline. So I'm working on that. That should be out later this fall. And I'm also working on a screenplay for Sweet, Sweet Spirit.
Woo.
Because there is some interest in making it into a film.
Wow, cool.
So I'm working on, at times, living in 1781 and other times 1970. So I'm kind of a time traveler right now.
Yeah, and that kind of plays with your brain a little bit.
Oh, it does. Ask my family.
I was speaking at Blue Ridge in May, and I brought up a photograph of Nellie Grant, her tomb. She was buried in Springfield Cemetery, not far from where Abraham Lincoln is buried.
Oh.
And I did not know that until I went to the cemetery to see Lincoln's tomb. And the funniest thing is that at the entrance to the cemetery, they've got a gift store. And it's like, how many cemeteries have a gift shop, right?
Not many.
Unless Abraham Lincoln's buried there, then, you can get your stovetop hat and, all, your Lincoln logs and all the rest. And while I was in the gift store, there was a little sign that said some of the famous people buried in the cemetery. And there's Nellie Grant. And so I went, and it took me a while to find it, but I finally found it. And when I did, I had the weirdest cognitive dissonance, because I don't know about you, but when I when I study these people, it's like they become almost like friends.
Yes.
To me, similar to people who read novels and the characters become like friends.
Yes.
These people become friends. And so in my mind, I see little Nellie Grant as a child, or I see her as the young woman who was married in the White House, or I see her as the young mother who comes back to comfort her father, as he's dying.
Mm-hmm.
And then I walk up to this grave and it's got moss growing on it, like lichen, the stuff that grows on a mountain.
Yeah.
It's a mixture of moss and mold or whatever it is. And the grave looked very old. And I did the math and it was like, she's been dead almost 100 years. And it was hard for my brain to comprehend that, this young girl in my mind had been dead for 100 years. And it felt like, Narnia, when they go back and all their friends are long dead because time has passed, Do you have the same kind of feeling sometimes?
Absolutely. And we're
kind of nuts,
I guess so. Yeah. You have to be a little bit loopy to do what we do.
Mm-hmm.
I feel very close to my 6 times great-grandfather because of all the writing that I've done about him and the research.
Yeah.
So he is, I'm not being spooky about it or anything because it's not like that, but he is very real to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I told you about this book here, Nobody Knows, Harry T. Burleigh. And, when I do a book, I do a deep dive. And so I try to just listen, not always, but majority of the time, listen to music from the era, watch movies from the era, read books from the era, read books about that person or about the time period. So I kind of, I kind of feel like I soak in it. And so when I was working on Burleigh, my son, Dave, well, first of all, I had posters up on the wall from the era, and I would listen. I found the PBS did this series of musical, back then it was on cassettes, and it was African American folk songs from the spirituals and plantation songs up through the Great Depression. So blues and jazz and all that. And so I just listened to that. That's all I listened to. And so one day my son came and said to me, Dad, he was at that time like 6 years old. He's now 28. And he said, Daddy, how long will Harry T. Burleigh be living with us? And then right around the same time, we had, or I had a dream, because Harry T. Burleigh's favorite restaurant in New York City was the Oyster Bar in Grand Central Station. And that is right under the main hall. And so it's got all those big, thick pillars, and it's a very unique place, but I had never been there at that time. And so I had a dream that I was at the Oyster Bar, and this waiter came up to me, an African-American man, and he leaned over, and I looked up, and the waiter was Harry T. Burleigh. And he said to me, "Thank you for remembering."
Wow.
Amazing. Now that could have been just my mind, but it could have been the Lord saying, let me pass along a little message to you. You just don't know. The Bible says that there's a great many witnesses. And so I think every once in a while, probably in heaven, our loved ones get a chance to glimpse and see what's here. Marlene Banks, who had interviewed me when Nobody Knows came out, she says, I love that book of yours, Nobody Knows. And she also said, yes, as a writer, your characters become real people in your mind, not merely characters. It's a product of our vivid imaginations. Has that been the case for you, Rebecca?
Definitely. Oh, definitely. And I have a habit of writing early every morning because I'm freshest then.
Me too.
And every time I go to my place to write, I feel like I'm going to be with friends. I'm my writer friends.
Yeah. What is that movie? It's the man who wrote Peter Pan, and it was I can't remember.
Barry?
What's that?
His name was Barry, wasn't
Right,
it?
right. But the movie was about how he met the boys that inspired Peter Pan and the Lost Boys there in
Oh.
London. I can't think of the name of it. It'll come to me. But there's an amazing scene where the character of Barry, he and his wife are having marital difficulties, and they're not even in the same bedrooms. They've got separate bedrooms. And so they're in the hallway, and they are, saying goodnight to each other. And then they both turn to go into their bedrooms, and hers is all dark, and she closes the door. He opens his door, and it's this wonder. It's like he's walking into paradise with all this color and birds, and the sky is bright and all that. And it was the metaphor of him walking into his imagination.
Mm.
And in this film, Finding Neverland is the name of this movie. It is, I highly if you're a writer, you need to watch Finding Neverland, because in so many ways they show the way that you and I do, and Marlene and others who are writers do what we do, and how he would observe things and make notes, and then those things would be then put into the books.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just it's a wonderful, wonderful film that I highly recommend.
I'll have to look it up.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, any final thoughts as far as, what maybe some advice you could give to those who are interested in getting involved in historical writing?
Mm-hmm. I think it's an important time right now to be telling the stories of the past. I think that we need to persevere and uncover stories that well, let me put it this way. I believe history is about God's activity in human, or the human story.
I agree.
And so I'm all about revealing his fingerprints, showing how he has worked in our history from the beginning until now.
Yeah.
And so for me, it's all about encouraging people, about bringing those stories to life, because the God who has been faithful will continue to be faithful. And I believe that history is going to a climactic point, and wherever we're at along the continuum, we're part of that plan. So I think the best writing comes out of that kind of viewpoint.
Yes.
I can't speak for those who might come from a more secular viewpoint, because that's not something I really relate to. But to me, it's all about telling stories of courage and showing how those who came before us lived and had their being at times that were equally stressful in their own ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree with you. I think that history is a wonderful way, in my opinion, to show the reality that there really is a God who's truly involved in human affairs. Someone once said that one of the greatest evidences of God is the rebirth of Israel.
Yes.
And I wrote a book called I Am Cyrus, Harry S. Truman and the Rebirth of Israel, because I felt like there is so much false narrative and propaganda out there against what really happened in the rebirth of Israel. And so my goal was to write it with two things in mind. One was to tell this story in as so logical a manner that it could be defended before the Supreme Court, that the rebirth of Israel could be defended before the Supreme Court. So there are more than 1,200 endnotes that I include in that book. And but the other side was I wanted to write it like you talked about. I wanted it to be a page turner so that people would want to keep reading to get the whole story. Because I get frustrated with the 24-hour news cycle and the sound bites, because these journalists want you to believe that they know history, when in reality, a lot of them are just parroting what other people are saying. They have no idea what really happened.
Right.
And when you challenge them on it, they just go back to their, rewarmed over sound bites that are knee jerk. And so I wanted to write something to say, all right, you answer this. Don't give me your knee jerk stuff. Go back and read this. And if you need to, follow those end notes and do your own research, then make up your mind. Don't just go by some sort of, talking points from a certain political party. So for me, I absolutely agree with what you're saying, but I also think that it's good for us as Christians to also tell some of the dark side as well. And I tell the story of Denzel Washington, who is a Bible-believing Christian. He reads his Bible every day. He prays every day. He's the son of a Pentecostal pastor. And he told the story of how one time he received this script and he was reading it. And as he's going through, it was all about drugs and violence and prostitution and people using other people and being ugly and murder. And it was a terrible script as far as the human condition. And he got to the end and he turned it over and he wrote on the end. It was very well written, but it was very ugly. And he said, "The wages of sin is death," on the back. And he decided to take the role so that he could show what would happen if you turn against God and follow after this path. And that was Training Day. And he ended up winning the Oscar for Best Actor.
Wow.
And I believe that there is a place for us as Christians to not only tell the happy and light stories, but also to show the dark side of humanity. So, for example, I wrote a book about a survivor of the Holocaust. And it is very dark for most of it. But then it ends with hope because she survived. And it shows that as children of God, that we can always keep our eyes fixed on him, the author and the finisher of our faith, even in the darkest days, because Jesus said, in this world, you will have trouble, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. So there is the light of Jesus, but there's also the darkness of a fallen world. And I remember this one missionary to Africa early in my ministry and in my writing days. She told me, Jesus is the Passover lamb. And in the Passover, they ate the sweet meat and enjoyed the sweet meat of the lamb, but they also dipped in and ate the bitter herbs. That is our life until Jesus returns.
Yes,
and so I
it
think
is.
we as writers need to show both sides.
I think that you mentioned the 24/7 news cycle, and I think that what that doesn't do is what history does accomplish, and that is it gives us perspective.
Yes.
And I always like the way the biblical writers present human nature and the history of the Bible, that you see it all.
Yeah.
It doesn't gloss over the ugliness.
Yeah. In my opinion, that's one of the proofs that the Bible is authentic.
I think so too. And I think that there's always hope. That's the thing, that there is this tremendous darkness and fallenness, but because of the resurrection, because of God's great promises, we are not consumed.
Yes.
And there is the ultimate victory.
Amen. Amen. Well, we will leave it there because we're just about out of time, but tell folks where they can learn more about your books, where they can order your books, and where they can see you when you're out and about.
My website has all the information about my books and my social media. It's www.rebeccapricejanney.com. It's
Just
easy
like
to
what's
remember.
written right there without the spaces.
There you go.
Right.
And I'm on, let's see, Me, We, Getter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. I'm around the neighborhood.
Biggies.
Yes. So you can find me out there, and my website tells usually where I'm appearing or speaking.
Wonderful.
And
wonderful.
People can communicate with me through any of these methods.
So RebeccaPriceJanney.com.
Mm-hmm.
Very good.
And my books are at Amazon, Barnes and Noble,
and wherever books are sold.
Yes.
Very good. Well, I'm sure that people will want to get out there and and get a hold of these books. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. And I want to remind folks that we are here every Thursday night, 7 p.m. Eastern U.S. time for Stories and Myths. And if you are interested in checking out my books, you can go to my website, which is vonbuseck.com. It's my last name without the space, vonbuseck.com. And all of the information is there for you to find. So for Dr. Rebecca Price Janney, I'm Craig Von Buseck. We will see you here again next week on Stories and Myths. Same bat time, same bat channel. Bye-bye.
Bye.